Hi everyone, let's get started. Let's get started. I'm Elke Weber. I'm a professor here at the C-PREE SPEAR and also the Anninger Center for Energy and Environment. And it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Bradlow, the Bradford speaker today. Ben is an assistant professor here at Princeton, jointly appointed in SPEAR and also the Department of Sociology. He's a man in great demand. Here at Princeton, he's affiliated with 7 other programs and groups, including C-PREE, PEERS, HMEI, and then the programs of Urban Studies, African Studies, Latin American Studies, and the Brazil Lab. Running out of breath, just listening. And then further abroad, he's a visiting researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Ben started out with a BA in history at Swarthmore, then he got a master's in city planning, MIT, and most recently a PhD in sociology from Brown University. Prior to arriving at Princeton 2 years ago, he was a postdoc and lecturer at Harvard University. Before and in between these academic ventures, Ben also was a denizen of the real world. He worked as a researcher and organizer at Shack Slum Dwellers International in South Africa, and then also as a journalist in Joburg and in Philadelphia. Ben's research makes important connections between climate change, urbanization, technological change, and political challenges of democracy that confront societies across the globe. His first book, Urban Power, Democracy and Inequality in Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, was published in 2024 by Princeton University Press, and it won the Best Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association. He's currently researching a new comparative book entitled The Climate Hinge, Green Industrial Transitions in the Global South. His research also appears in leading journals in sociology, economics, environmental and urban studies, and public health. And in addition, he regularly writes for public-facing outlets like Foreign Affairs or Bloomberg's City Lab. Today, he will tell us about the problem of climate change and the analogy of development. Please join.
So thank you so much, Elke, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to present to the Bradford seminar. I'm going to do 2 things today. First, I'm going to share some ongoing work that aims to conceptualize how my discipline of sociology and social science more broadly can perhaps more helpfully conceptualize and study climate change. And second, I'm going to illustrate how I'm doing that through relatively new field-based research in the auto sector in Brazil and South Africa. And given that this work is ongoing, I'm especially interested in your questions and comments at the end of this presentation. So my starting point today is descriptive. That is that the global north has shifted from a focus on using the price mechanism to address the perils of global warming to instead using the state as an institutional sphere that can pursue the combination of goals of economic development and climate mitigation. But this presentation focuses on a more argumentative contention, that the turn to industrial policy in the global north is producing deepened contradictions between mitigating global warming and development in the global south, and that this is happening at precisely the moment that developmentalism in the global south has become more relevant than ever, precisely because of climate concerns. So to start off, I want to suggest that to understand and analyze the problem of climate change, or even to solve the problem of climate change, we need to understand it as a problem of industrial change. This allows us to use well-tested tools at the heart of the social scientific enterprise, and particularly, I'm going to talk about economic sociology, to conceptualize and understand efforts to mitigate climate change, which otherwise might present some fundamental problems for analysis. So let's first take a step back. When we talk about climate change as a problem, what are we talking about? At the most basic level, we're talking about how human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, 4/5 of which are from carbon, are making the planet unsustainable. And this is producing powerful global social transformations. Just to summarize 3 salient examples among many, climate change is revolutionizing patterns of migration, primarily within and across the global south, but also between the global south and global north. And this is due to direct effects of climate change, such as changing crop yields for those working in the agricultural sector, as well as due to indirect effects. So most notably, a global rise in armed conflicts is increasingly associated with climate effects, such as changing rainfall patterns and reduced land area available for pastoral communities. Our imagination of the sociological effects of climate change should not only be rural. In fact, the explosion of climate-induced migration is ultimately an urban issue. The primary receiving areas of these migrants are the urban informal settlements of the global south. 1 in 7 humans now lives in a slum, a share that population demographers suggest will continue to rise. If the first 2 waves of global urbanization were those associated with the Industrial Revolution, and then in the latter part of the 20th century in the global south, associated with neoliberal globalization, we're now witnessing a 3rd global wave of urbanization that's associated with climate change. And the consequence is that global politics is being upended by climate change. The rise in xenophobia and racism as a structuring force in national politics is not only something shaping the rise of right-wing populism as a phenomenon of the global north, but it has fueled the rise of the authoritarian right in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So social science and sociology can treat climate change in a few different ways. And the predominant mode, at least in the mainstream of my discipline, has been largely to ignore it. And I'm not going to diagnose all the reasons for why that might be, but one recent study found that between 2015 and 20, less than 5% of articles published in the leading generalist journals in the discipline had climate change as a central concern. And this is changing, even in the last couple of years since that study was done. But then there's still some questions about what the discipline should be doing if it isn't ignoring climate change. Sociology can focus on the effects of how to adapt to climate change, which essentially means treating climate change as an independent variable. Sociology can be reactive, that is, that it can try to understand the social underpinnings of the problem, in essence treating climate change itself as a dependent variable. Or social science can theorize climate change as a meta process of change that is reshaping all aspects of society. And with this framing, the overriding research question becomes, how do societies move from one energy basis of economic life to another? And my view is this latter approach, to treat the problem of climate change as an encompassing process of change in the energy basis of social life. But this presents difficulties for modern social science, because modern social science is rooted in only one other such change, which is the emergence of modernity that birthed the modern social sciences. The emergence of industrial modernity has a single basis in energy, fossil fuels, the proximate human cause of climate change. So we might recall, and some of you who are not in the social sciences may not recall, but Max Weber once described the endpoint of what he termed the modern economic order. He wrote, "This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force, perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burnt." So 120 years after Weber wrote those words, have we reached the end of this modern economic order? We've often taken, in the social sciences, we've often taken the material basis of economies for granted, and particularly what I mean is the energy basis of economies for granted. We often talk a lot about states and markets, but rarely about energy in the social sciences. We've theorized development, and I'm going to talk a lot about that in the coming slides, but not under conditions of planetary constraint. And too often we focused on the global north in the social sciences as if the global south were just a recipient of systems, not as a producer of futures. In fact, post-World War II experiences of so-called developmental catch-up are increasingly seen as useful for beginning to theorize and to make policy for how societies move from one energy basis of economic life to another. Why are these cases useful? The structure of markets and politics and the problems of technology are all at least recognizable to our current situation today. These cases illustrate the difficulties and possibilities of changing the economic organization of a society in the context of increasingly integrated global markets, the political competition between liberal democracy and authoritarian developmentalism structures the geopolitics of global markets, and the technologies that are most clearly implicated in carbon emissions were critical to the strategies of developmental technological upgrading for late developers. The best known such cases are the authoritarian East Asian cases of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and more recently in China. And two key insights from economic sociology have been wielded to explain their dramatic leaps towards manufacturing at the technological frontier and generating higher incomes. In these cases, organizational dynamics, particularly high trust, so-called embedded social ties between business elites and key bureaucrats, helped facilitate a process of orienting business towards exports. Further, iterative processes of learning by doing helped corporations to move up the technological frontier to the point where these countries are now known for producing some of the most advanced technology on the planet. In fact, even more advanced in some instances than the US today. But these were authoritarian cases, and perhaps they don't quite fit the political sensibilities of some of us in Princeton, in the Northeast United States. So what became increasingly important to many social scientists was the importance of human capital in driving development. In fact, in the East Asian cases just mentioned, the role of high human capital was increasingly understood as a precondition for development success, but investing in welfare states came to be seen as an alternate approach to developmental catch-up. So in Kerala, southern state in India that's larger than most countries in the world, strong links between organized labor and a political party of the left spurred increased investments in growing a welfare state, particularly public health, which has allowed the state to become one of the wealthiest in India, in effect, an upper middle income state in a lower middle income country. In Brazil, a similar alliance of organized labor and a political party of the left enabled the country to achieve strong growth rates and one of the most remarkable drops in income inequality during the height of global neoliberalism in the first decade of the 2000s. And these democratic cases have suggested that meso-level dynamics of movements and public bureaucracies allow us to see how it's possible to construct strong welfare protections in contexts where more structural accounts of global capitalism would lead us to expect otherwise. The point here isn't to glorify either model. It's to remind us that development has always been a conflictual and coalition-driven process, one that takes shape around political struggles, institutional legacies, and shifting economic frontiers. So all of these cases have the same energy source as their underpinnings, which is fossil fuels. But what can these cases mean for thinking about climate change as a meta process of change? And what I mean by this is that social life in the Anthropocene, the period in which human activity changes the Earth's atmosphere, is leading to attempts to reshape economic orders to change the energy basis of social life. And rich countries in the global north, those who preceded late developers at the technological frontier, are taking lessons from these late developers. So for a while, the price mechanism predominated in public debate around climate policy, that is, to build markets for carbon. Beyond the political problems with instituting these policies, we've seen a growing recognition that purely market-based pricing is unlikely to produce technological switching points of the type required when such technologies are not mature in terms of scale and availability. The rise of green industrial policies until recently in the US and continuing in Europe aims to build ties between public bureaucracies and private corporations that can enable goal-oriented technological shifts. So the adoption of renewable energy production and electrifying transportation are where much of this effort has gone. Now, rich countries are pursuing green industrial policies largely with no acknowledgement of two ironies. First, these industrial policies had increasingly fallen out of favor as rich countries pushed developing nations to open up their markets to global trade. So this coincided with increased divergence between poor and rich nations by the early 2000s. Now that rich countries are pursuing policies that protect and subsidize domestic markets to reshape the technological frontier, a big question remains whether they will once again, to quote Ha-Joon Chang, a prominent development theorist, kick away the ladder for poor countries to move up global value chains. Second, the majority of the carbon currently warming the atmosphere beyond sustainable levels was emitted by rich countries. So you can see here the composition of historic emissions that are currently in the atmosphere. The turn of rich countries towards industrial policy carries little acknowledgement of the financial and moral implications of that historic legacy in trying to develop industries that can stop warming the atmosphere. Poor and middle-income countries in the global south have learned different lessons. First, the established path to raising incomes relies on essentially growing emissions. And this is what the global south is doing. So much so that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions today comes from these countries. And here you can see the composition of the flow of emissions into the contemporary flow of emissions into the atmosphere. But for countries in the global south to switch their economic trajectories to emit less, they face barriers of both finance and technological know-how. And these are two barriers that the global north might be able to help with. In coal-dependent middle-income countries like South Africa, a group of rich countries have come together over the past 3 years to develop what are called just energy transition partnerships. These are designed to help recipient countries to wean themselves off of high-emitting energy sources like coal and to develop new green industries. So South Africa is the furthest along in terms of implementation of the 5 countries that have negotiated these agreements. The scale of finance in South Africa's agreement is less than 1/10 of what is estimated by the South African government to be the country's necessary funds for such a transition. And plans to wind down coal mines are generating significant new pressure points of political anger, which was represented in this recent cover of the country's leading business weekly magazine. So, what are some lessons from these recent attempts by rich countries in a new green development agenda? First, rich country green industrial policies could potentially be kicking away the ladder for climate-friendly development in the rest of the world. Second, the climate finance that does exist is largely focused on decommissioning carbon and not development. But what matters is not just finance. And in recent work, I've written about how green technology transfers are likely critical to enable catch-up development amid a rapidly changing green technological frontier. What's clear is that the political imperative across the globe is behind strategies that raise incomes. And usually that has meant to focus on growing economies, whether by emitting or not. So what rich country industrial policies have done is suggest that a focus on technological innovation makes it possible to imagine the joining together of growth and reducing emissions. And this is not a crazy proposition, as this figure from the Financial Times suggests. Here you can see a decoupling of emissions from growth as increasingly plausible, including in some middle-income countries in the global south. I should point out, this figure does not incorporate emissions that are displaced to third countries. But even so, you can see, at least within national boundaries, there's some meaningful decoupling that's occurring. So my discipline of I've talked a lot about growth, but my discipline of sociology has never been a discipline obsessed with growth for growth's sake. In fact, it's inequality and not growth that has been a central axis of the discipline's research on questions of political and economic sociology. Sociologists want to know who is green growth for, that is, who receives the gains of such growth. We want to know who is shaping policy and firm strategy for green growth. We want to know who is doing the actual work, the labor of green growth. and we want to know the political coalitions that sustain these models of growth. So while much of the work in sociology that has addressed climate change has focused on how climate change produces or reproduces a range of social inequalities, I want to propose that an economic sociology of climate change can also shed light on questions of industrial change. First, it can do so through a focus on how social relations are transformed when the goals of interacting through markets are not measured only by prices, but by emissions or technological outputs. Second, through a focus on how transformations of markets targeting green industrial change alters economic inequalities and is aimed at producing forms of what we might think of as a social peace. So for example, the former US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has written and spoken about green industrial policy and its trade implications as, quote, a foreign policy for the middle class. This is a phrase that is begging for a sociological analysis. Third, we can bring meso-level tools of analysis to understand how social resources are mobilized for collective action in institutions. And we can bring these same tools of economic and organizational sociology to bear on our understanding of the transnational dimensions of industrial change. Given the global inequalities of both growth and emissions, the Global South is a critical part of the world in which to analyze these issues. And in new field-based research in Brazil and South Africa, I've begun examining these questions by looking at efforts to transition export-oriented auto manufacturing sectors focused on internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles when the Global North is about to ban sales of combustion engine cars. So I want to turn to a few initial observations from this new research in Brazil and South Africa that illustrates each of these approaches that I've just laid out about how we can orient a new economic sociology of climate change. But first I want to just mention briefly why I'm looking at Brazil and South Africa. These aren't just two large democracies in the Global South. These are upper middle income countries with significant export-oriented industrial histories in the auto sector. In terms of industrial sectors as a whole, both countries are prime exemplars of what the economist Danny Roderick has referred to as premature deindustrialization. These are countries where we see deep traditions of industrial labor mobilization, particularly by metal workers in the auto sector. In fact, in Brazil, Lula, the president, was himself once an auto worker, which he reminds the people of Brazil every time he gestures with his hand in a public forum because he lost his pinky finger in an accident in an auto factory. And the auto sectors in both countries were central to past development strategies in both countries over the past half century. And they now sit at the center of global prospects for an EV transition beyond the US and EU and China. So the methods that I undertook or that I have been undertaking with this research are largely semi-structured interviews so far conducted with 75 auto firm executives, startups and infrastructure firms focused on electric charging for cars, national economic policy makers, state and local officials, metal workers, union officials. I've visited assembly lines so far just in Brazil to understand the work that's being done to convert combustion engine assembly lines to making EVs and hybrid cars, as well as electric bus assembly lines, and then also some archival research among various laws, news pronouncements, internal firm publications, and historical accounts of the auto sectors in both countries. So first, the Brazilian case. Brazil is the largest auto manufacturer in South America, which over the past decade has produced between 2 and 3.5 million cars per year, all by multinational companies. There's no firm of meaningful size that is wholly Brazilian owned. The role of markets in driving technological switching points is subject to fierce contestation. And this is because of a somewhat unique set of conditions in Brazil, which has well-developed technology for mixing sugarcane-derived ethanol as fuel in internal combustion engine vehicles. So across my interviews with firm executives, union leaders, and officials in the Ministry of Industrial Development, nobody sees a clear technological path between electric battery-based vehicles or ethanol fuel-based combustion engine vehicles. In Europe and the US, industrial policies have been quite clear about this technological path, aiming to ban sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles within the next decade. But in Brazil, this future is much less settled, as the key official for the auto sector in the Ministry of Trade and Industry put it quite bluntly: the market will decide the technological priority. And this is what she answered when I asked her, will this ever end up in an industrial policy document? She was saying, no, it will not. The return of Lula to the presidency has brought with it a renewed focus on industrial policy, with a significant focus on the auto sector. But this sector is not easily subject to state direction, as it is entirely controlled by multinational corporations. At the same time that there's an increased focus on industrial policy, the major sector that's driving domestic growth in Brazil is in agriculture. And one byproduct is that this may favor a technological direction in cars that is potentially at odds with the global trend in the sector, favoring ethanol hybrids over battery electric vehicles. And the sector is subject to the entrance of new corporate actors from China. So this pictured here is an article in one of the main news publications in Brazil that refers to a, quote, Chinese invasion in the sector. And at the firm level, this is also producing an interesting set of micro-level dynamics as Chinese firms encounter long-time local actors. I spoke to one executive who has worked in a range of European and Japanese firms, who most recently served as the Brazilian conduit for the entrance of Great Wall Motors, a Chinese firm with a factory in the interior of Sao Paulo state. In describing how his Chinese colleagues perceived him, he said to me, they thought I was a Western barbarian. So there's a real kind of culture clash that actors in this sector are describing at the micro level. Institutional features of the auto sector are also being transformed. So first, to continue talking about the entrance of Chinese firms in the sector, the world's largest electric vehicle maker, which is BYD, has recently announced that it will take over an abandoned Ford factory in the state of Bahia. And this is consequential for a few reasons. First, it solidifies the changing geography of auto manufacturing within Brazil, increasingly decentered from the southeastern state of Sao Paulo, the historic home of the sector. This entrance of BYD into the state of Bahia was reportedly enabled by negotiations between a delegation led by Lula to Beijing in May of 2023, during which time the governor of the state of Bahia agreed to a set of tax incentives for BYD to locate in the state. Second, I spoke with an engineer and union representative with years of experience in the factory where BYD will now locate. He described a sprawling complex in which tens of different subcontractors and parts providers are all co-located. So this is a place where an increasingly divided and diffuse workplace prevails. And this presents challenges for the historic corporate-sponsored worker training institution known by its Portuguese initials as SENAI. A representative of SENAI in Brasilia reported to me that they have yet to be able to develop training programs for workers that are specific to the electric vehicle supply chain, in part because they haven't found a clear corporate partner in which to design these programs. All right, South Africa tells a very different story. It has one of the most carbon-intensive electricity grids in the world, almost entirely coal-based. In contrast, Brazil has one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world. And having such a coal-based grid creates enormous obstacles for any green industrial transition. The utility crisis around the state-owned energy producer and provider called Eskom has become symbolic for the broader political economy of the country. Rolling blackouts, infrastructural decay, and political gridlock. And while South Africa was an early focus of international climate finance through the Just Energy Transition Partnership process, actual investment in green manufacturing, particularly with respect to EVs, has been weak. Auto executives in the country report to me that they effectively wrote their own EV policy white paper for the South African Ministry of Trade and Industry, and then have spent almost 5 years pushing for its consideration by the country's cabinet within the presidency. South Africa's industrial politics are shaped by powerful incumbent interests across government, organized labor, and business who have deep stakes in coal and existing auto production. So pictured here is Gwede Mantashe, who until recently held probably the most important position within the ruling African National Congress as a Secretary General. He's also the Minister of Mines, previously Mines and Energy. And he himself was a coal worker. And he's served as avatar for these incumbent interests in the internal conflicts within the South African government, referring to efforts to attract green industrial development as forms of neo-colonialism. So the alignment of actors oriented towards green technology struggles, the alignment of actors oriented towards green technology struggles to emerge in the face of these deep powers of incumbency. And one thing that I'm arguing here is that you don't see the same kinds of incumbent interests in Brazil, though in all contexts across the globe, there is some degree of incumbent interest, but it's precisely because of this core, the core nature of the energy basis of the country's grid itself that these incumbent interests are different. There's also a fragmented state apparatus in the South African case. The donor-funded Just Energy Transition Partnership has led to a concentration of climate policy making within the presidency, outside of the control of ministers like Mantashe, who you saw pictured on the previous slide. But actors within these presidential bodies, such as the Presidential Climate Commission, and there's a report from this commission pictured here, have reported to me that this creation of new climate bodies within the presidency has merely internalized conflict with fossil fuel incumbents rather than sidestepped such conflict, such that there's a degree of policy gridlock as opposed to being able to kind of like use the presidency to get around the other organs of the executive in the government. So while Brazil is experimenting, however unevenly, with technological transitions in its auto sector, South Africa is stalled, caught in a kind of high carbon holding pattern. Just to give you one sense of what this means in terms of tracking things like FDI, foreign direct investment from a firm like BYD, the largest EV maker in the country, South Africa, policymakers in South Africa have been quite clear to me that they have been pursuing very similar kinds of investments to what Brazil has been achieving now with BYD. And they haven't been able to get anything beyond kind of like promises to talk some more. All right, what do we learn from this comparison? First, energy systems shape broader development trajectories. Second, the kinds of institutions that are prior to moments of attempts at green transitions structure possibilities for actually realizing those transitions in key industrial sectors. And there are distinct dynamics of how coalitions, political coalitions, can drive or stall change to move past the power of incumbent interests. So we might think of Brazil and South Africa as case studies from the periphery, but in a certain sense, that's misleading. The Global South is not peripheral to the green transition. It's analytically central. It's where most future emissions will come from. It's where industrial growth is at its most contested. And it's where the hinge points of global geopolitics, especially around technology, finance, and energy, will be shaped in the coming decades. So if we want to understand the future of switching points in economic life, we need to start with these places, I want to suggest, and not end with them. So what does this all mean for sociology, and particularly economic sociology? First, we have to rethink how we understand markets, not just as price mechanisms or in the more sociological formulation of markets as arenas of relational exchange, but as socially constructed and socially purposive institutions oriented towards specific kinds of goals. So in the climate transition, markets are being built with new goals well beyond prices, such as lower emissions, technological localization, employment generation, and even geopolitical strategic autonomy. Again, to take the example of electric vehicles, governments are creating new markets for EVs through public procurement, emission standards, tariff policies, and infrastructure investment. This is not an invisible hand. This is a very visible, very political state redesigning what markets are for. Second, we need to expand how we think about institutions and organizations. The climate transition is not just a regulatory challenge, but an institutional and organizational one. Ministries, subnational agencies, public banks, labor unions, auto firms, they're all navigating overlapping logics of emissions compliance, labor protection, and political legitimacy, and all are being shaped by processes of technological innovation. Theories of the firm, of state capacity, of organizational fields, all need to account for the materiality of decarbonization in these approaches to studying institutions and organizations. And economic sociology has to integrate an analytical perspective on the global political economy. Climate change is reshaping the geopolitical structure of production. Global value chains are being restructured through trade rules, intellectual property regimes, and national industrial policies. Countries are competing and sometimes weaponizing access to minerals, technology, and infrastructure. And the Global South is not just adapting to this, it's a terrain on which this contest is playing out. So in this sense, economic sociology needs to scale up. We need theories that can hold together domestic institutional change and transnational power dynamics. And this brings me to a final point. We have to stop treating the Global South as a test case or a footnote to Northern strategies. This is the site of the majority of future emissions, the hinge of global, and it's the hinge of global climate geopolitics. So if economic sociology is going to help us understand and shape this transition, it must begin with the South and not just extend to it. And I'm not making this as a normative claim, but as an analytical necessity. So to conclude, I want to suggest that this talk today has provided some initial ways of thinking about how sociology, and particularly economic sociology, is a particularly strategic window into a much deeper encounter between sociology and the social sciences and climate change. First, we can conceptualize the problem of climate change as a problem of the energy basis of economic life. And in doing so, we can orient an economic sociology of climate change towards understanding how the meso and micro-level organization of social life shapes efforts to change the energy basis of economic life. Our climate-changed world has thrown into sharp relief the necessity to rethink the economic world that we've inherited and the economic world that is in the process of arriving. Thank you very much.
Your thoughts about how your work and sociology in general can inform our understanding of which kind of policies are likely to be successful in the global south and South Africa or Brazil. Both of those countries have been implementing carbon pricing. You also talked about industrial policy there. How do you think about the sustainability of different policy instruments from the sociological perspective?
Yeah, in fact, I'm not sure yet whether there's a fully elaborated predictive apparatus here. But what I'm doing with this paper in this project is to suggest what I think are some of the key, not just scales of analysis, but key concepts of analysis on which to focus if you're going to make this more kind of predictive analysis. So I think that the energy basis of economies has been overlooked quite a bit. In fact, a lot of the kinds of policy discussions that you see focusing on the global south and green industrial transition will focus on the prospective mineral endowments of those countries and what those minerals might be able to provide for those countries. But what I'm suggesting is that there's actually a broader historical trajectory of how energy has shaped growth trajectories in these countries that may be even more consequential than whether X country has lithium, copper, and 5 other minerals as the basis for its possibilities for developmental change. And so that also speaks to the questions of incumbency. What I'm presenting here allows us to understand what kinds of incumbencies matter. And a lot of those incumbencies actually come from these broader energy histories and the way that those have shaped the organizations that both set policy and try to implement new technological innovations at the firm level. Yeah, I would say those are kind of like the 2 key factors. The third would be geopolitical niches, and I think that allows us to disaggregate this category of the global south. And in fact, there are multiple global souths in a sense, where some countries in this category we call the global south have much stronger possibilities of leveraging, in particular, leveraging China versus the US or the US versus China, and others are basically not, they don't have enough leverage with either to get gains to pursuing green technological transformation. We got Laura, Elka, and then you. Yeah. Yeah.
I take your point specifically about the need for theorizing climate change a little more rigorously from a sociological lens. But I'm curious how you see the process of climate change, how it's affecting different institutions, world systems, things like that, as being something that is occurring within these existing theoretical frames that we have, or as something that's happening outside the theoretical frames and then needed a new theory of climate change in order to, or the process of climate change in
What is the contradiction that you're identifying, or what is the? I'm not sure I see the tension that you're identifying.
That you're focused on like having the global south as the core focus of
Yeah.
the new theory.
Okay.
The global
Okay.
south has been peripheralized in a lot of
Mhm.
ways that we have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the simple point is just that this is where most of the emissions are coming from. So the nature of achieving transition in these contexts has quite significant bearing on the future trajectory of emissions globally. So in that sense, that's not even such a theoretical move. It's just an empirical move to say, like, if you want to get a handle on the problem, this is where it is. What you're getting at is there still are these major global power imbalances that shape why we're even invoking this term global south to begin with. And so my only point there is to say we should be explicit that this power imbalance exists and that the kinds of degrees of freedom that a Brazil or South Africa are going to have in terms of pursuing technological change are going to be very different than, for example, an EU, which can set a price on key goods that have embodied carbon, and the whole world will have to respond to it in the case of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So those are kind of like the two simple points that I'm trying to get at in shifting the geography of where this kind of work happens. Okay.
So you gave us a very convincing intellectual argument for why sociology cannot afford to ignore climate change. And Bob Cohen has been arguing something very similar for political science. And in addition to that, also looking organizing conferences, making sure that there's funding on those topics. Is there something similar happening in sociology?
Well, in the discipline, I think the one thing that is happening is for the last 40 years or so, there's been a subfield of environmental sociology, and I think that that has been, there's an increasing recognition, including among many veterans of environmental sociology, that a sociology of climate change actually opens a much more expansive way to get into these issues, and it's not just about kind of the nature-society interaction, but there's a much wider set of issues that can be addressed through a sociology of climate change. And then the only other thing that I'll say is Navroz and I are starting to put together over the next 3 years a series of workshops at Princeton on climate change and development, which will certainly be oriented towards this kind of frame. So that's kind of one infrastructural contribution that I'm pursuing in precisely that regard.
You can just maybe add another side note. Psychology has exactly the same
Yeah,
problem.
I'm sure. Yeah. I think a lot of disciplines do. But yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for this talk. I had a question now. Maybe another question based off this exchange. I like one of your comments on the last thing, so raise that first and then go to the question. Just a brief comment about you raised an interesting point about how you think climate change, as opposed to environmental sociology or discipline environmental or any other discipline, maybe has an opportunity for being more a wider net of some kind, or maybe not. Maybe that's something for. I just wonder, like, that could be true in some ways, but probably very untrue in others. For instance, and I know in a lot of, like, in ecology, for instance, there's a lot of frustration sometimes with over-focus on climate as opposed to other problems. So that'd be one thought about, like, a question about this, like, how is climate change interacting with other, like, ecological crises, which also are, like, destabilizing the basis for life, including energy and all that. The other question I had was more about, you emphasized your time this analogy of development. So thinking about the analogy, a lot of, and if you think about the development of an organism, right, there's this idea of getting to some kind of end state of maturity. And if you think about the analogy of kicking with a ladder, that almost seems to suggest that, like there's a ladder you're climbing to the current maybe 0 norm of what I don't know, what the UK or what the United States looks like in terms of its economy, and that should be the goal of development. The one place you mentioned. So the question is like, what do you see differences in what the end state of development is? Is it there's just a broad assumption that you're just trying to get exactly to this place? Is there like a kind of more pluralistic or kind of multi-world model of like thinking about what are the different futures that we could be developing towards? And do you see a place in this project for also thinking about that? Because I mean, the most common cases become problems when you think what should the development goal be? Is it growth, as you economic growth, as you highlighted, or should it be something else that's maybe more holistic, include other models such as growth? And so I just wonder about. It seems like a lot of this is focused on like the development procedural stage, but I did some invitation to reflect a little bit on the end.
Yeah. So your first question about a whole host of ecological issues beyond climate change. In part, I think that's a good reason why we need to retain an environmental social science, things like environmental sociology. These will remain important issues beyond the study of climate change, though certainly like many of these areas are being affected by climate change in one way or another. And that's why I try to orient this work towards a sociology of climate change rather than an environmental sociology, precisely because in environmental sociology, I think this would be one concern among others. But the nature of climate change is such that it's quite encompassing across a number of parts of how we think about social science. And then the issue of other goals beyond development. So the version of this that I have heard before when presenting this, and I thought you might land there, but you managed to avoid the word, was degrowth.
I actually did say that.
Oh, okay. All right. I didn't hear that one. Okay. So, and again, this is not a normative work. This is, social science, there's often like some normative motivations behind social science, but I'm not pitching this in a normative frame. And so I actually, in that sense, I don't have to take a position on degrowth other than to say that this is not a frame that has significant traction in the mainstream politics of most, though not all, of cases in the global south. And what does seem more, and so there are some cases actually where, like when Colombia decided to stop using oil, that's a case where other considerations predominated. But for the vast majority of cases, the politics of growth and the politics of raising incomes and lifestyles is absolutely central. And part of what I'm trying to do here is to just note this is an empirical social fact, as it were, of the politics of development and the politics of climate change. And so things like industrial change are going to be absolutely central to how most countries will process politically the politics of climate change.
Just to say, I was thinking that not just like things other than development, but what is using that as an analogy.
Yeah.
What is it development towards? And then just thinking, and that was us.
Okay, the analogy, yeah.
What is the vision in these different countries? Like, what is the? I mean, obviously, it's not just one. It's not a monolith. But I think that maybe discussing in this project just a little clarification, but especially maybe for maybe it's in certain groups, it just goes without saying what the kind of end state, the end goal is. But there's maybe in different, presumably different societies, there's different things that development, like maybe healthcare is more primary, more maybe like just more technologies.
Yeah.
There's going to be some, cultures that are more about, that are like a little less interested in maybe technology and more into like food security and more into like their own kind of autonomy and political development. So I'm just inviting you to think about like clarifying this part of what is the goal in these kind of contexts of what is development towards, and then obviously energy is going to play a role in basically any plausible, any common answer to that question. And that also just then maybe opens up possibilities in some cases towards, because some are going to wonder if maybe we need to consider, and then just using just like this Eurocentric model, whatever it is that the current United States or Europe looks like is where everyone else needs to go. Maybe that is just what's desired.
Yeah.
And then that would still be, that would have helped me.
Yeah, actually, what I'm saying is it's not the Europe and U.S. that are the prime goal. Countries are trying to be like Korea. Countries are trying, and increasingly countries are trying to be like China. And so I think these are the models that in some ways capture the global imagination in the contemporary moment much more so. I mean, there's a kind of American soft power that's cultural, but in terms of thinking about economic growth and the raising of livelihoods, I think late development is a much clearer kind of telos. I mean, and again, there's a problem with any telos in development. And the only reason why I'm invoking development here is that these late catch-up cases are a way analytically to get some leverage on how do societies produce large-scale social and economic transformations quickly. And in fact, nothing is as quick as what the science might say to us would be required to get to certainly holding at 1.5 degrees warming, but even increments higher than that. But the onus of all of climate change scientific work has been to figure out these large-scale switching points. And so I'm using development as a way to say, like, this is potentially the best that we have in terms of a historic example to get some leverage on how those switching points happen.
That's really helpful.
Neha, and then in the back. Yeah. Why don't you both ask, so then, because we're almost at time.
Thank you for the talk. I am specifically interested in this game around protectionist industrial policies in the global north, taking away the land of global countries. Like semantically to me, already that sounds centering and aggrandizing more global north's role in economic development and the climate transition. And because you mentioned coalitions, I am wondering what role is there for like multi-nation coalition in the global south to push back against some of these forces of the global north protectionism that can affect development.
Yes.
Could you comment on how population growth rates
Okay, so the first question is invoking kicking away the ladder, centering the global north. I mean, again, and this kind of goes back to the earlier question about power imbalances. You can't ignore the fact that you can't ignore where the technological frontier is. And so if this is a question about the scaling up and diffusion of new technologies, you have to be very concerned with where that technology is, and that technology is in US, China, Europe, Japan, Korea. So that has to be very central to the story. In terms of political coalitions pushing back, I mean, what I'm saying for this paper is the geopolitical alliances matter, the geopolitical niches matter. There are some coalitions that are emerging, but there's also good evidence emerging that it's not actually through these alliances that many global South nations are pursuing this kind of switch, and they're actually pursuing quite individual nation strategies outside of, say, a BRICS or like when India convenes these Global South forums. Those are more kind of talk shops compared to individual country strategies. The question about population growth rates. There's certainly imbalances in population growth rates across the world. I'm not a demographer, but I pay attention to some of the implications of demography for development. And population growth is a key ingredient to economic growth. And so, you even have in East Asia and in South America, population growth rates declining quite a bit. So these are becoming aging societies. And so that threatens the possibility for like, it would seem to me that could threaten the possibility for achieving quick technological switches, because you wouldn't have the kinds of mobilizations of capital that are often associated with the growth dynamics of economic growth dynamics of population growth. When do we go until? Okay, Sebastian, sorry.
Quick question. So how does these, in both cases, like, at least recently, democracy has also played a big role, and like the future of democratic politics, especially in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do these, like the coalition, like the changing coalitions around kind of the protection of democracy play out into the kind of climate change as development process? And do you see them as kind of mattering analytically so much as to like be included in like the model you're trying to develop?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure yet. That's something I'm still thinking about. And I think one has to take at least some inference from the fact that the East Asian cases, the nature of growth in the East Asian cases was perhaps a bit more durable and actually got them to be rich countries as opposed to middle-income countries, whereas the cases I've described here experienced some kind of like classic conditions of the middle-income trap. But yeah, I'm still thinking about the democracy question, as are we all.
Well, on that note, let's like